Yeah, good afternoon. I think we'll start. My name is Desmond Lochman, and I'm a resident fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute. And it's great to see such a good turnout for an event on China. China would always be something topical to talk about, at least from the economic point of view right now, for the very reason that China is now a very significant part of the global economy. You know, as one can see from this chart, which I've reproduced from the IMF, whereas in 1995, China was something like 2% of the global economy. Today, it is anywhere between 12 and 15% of the global economy, the second largest economy in the world. So what this means is that developments in China will have a very important bearing on the rest of the Asian economy, the rest of the global economy, commodity prices, and so on. And that is also very significant for what occurs to the U.S. economy. So for that very reason alone, it would be timely to have a discussion of China. Of course, there are additional reasons right now why it's worth discussing the Chinese economy, and that is because there's been a change in administration in the United States, and it seems that there could be a change in U.S.-Chinese trade relations. That it's well known that for some time now that the Trump administration has been complaining that China is a currency manipulator. China is taking advantage of the United States in trade relations. Something needs to be done about it. Should China be declared a currency manipulator? Should one impose import tariffs on them? And this raises the question of what, in fact, is the Trump administration likely to do? How is the Chinese government likely to react? And what implication does that have for global trade relations and for the global economy? There are a few other reasons why I thought that a seminar on China now might be appropriate. The one is that China is in the middle of a massive credit bubble, the likes of which we haven't seen. That this chart just indicates what is going on in terms of Chinese credit expansion to the non-government sector. And one sees that Chinese credit in the space of something like 6 or 7 years has increased by as much as 90% of GDP. To put that into perspective, this is a far more rapid buildup of credit than either that which preceded the Japanese lost decade in the 1990s, which is the black line, or that which preceded the United States housing bust in 2008. So this raises the question of how is China going to deflate this credit bubble? What happens afterwards? Is China in for a hard landing, or is China in for a similar kind of development as occurred in Japan? Many years of sluggish growth, zombie banks, and the like. Another reason that I thought China would be worth discussing is China is trying to transform its economic model away from investment, export-led model to something on a consumption basis. And it raises question, how successful have they been in doing this? What is likely to happen in the run-up to the important Communist Party convention towards the end of this year? What happens after that? So that is yet another reason that China is of interest right now. The last reason that I would say is that China, over the past 2 years, has been hemorrhaging capital at a very rapid rate. That this chart just shows the last 2 years, China has lost something like $1 trillion in international reserves. So that raises the question of how much more international reserves can China afford to lose, how effective are their capital controls likely to be, what does all of this mean for the way in which China is to manage its exchange rate. So there are a whole host of questions that I think can be discussed right now. We're very fortunate to have here with us a panel of real Chinese experts who will help us to answer at least some of these questions. And I'll just introduce them very briefly in the order in which they're going to be speaking. And I've asked each of them to talk for 10 to 15 minutes before we turn it over to questions and answers. The first sitting closest to me is David Dollar, who's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution China Center. David spent a long time actually in China from 2009 to 2013. He was the U.S. Treasury's economic and financial emissary to China, based in Beijing, looking at macroeconomics and financial policy dialogue between the United States and China. Prior to joining Treasury, David spent many years at the World Bank as the economic director for China, quite a number of those years based in Beijing. The next speaker would be Rory McFarker, who is presently a visiting fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics across the road. Previously, he worked in the Obama administration and served as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Global Economic Finance in the White House, National Security Council, and National Economic Council. At the White House, he led policy teams working on a wide range of international economic and trade issues, including U.S. China economic relations. Next will be my colleague, Derek Scissors, who's a resident scholar here at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on Chinese and Indian economics and on U.S. economic relations with Asia. He is concurrently chief economist of the Chinese Beige Book and is the author of China Global Investment Tracker. Before joining AEI, Derek was a senior research fellow in the Asian Studies Center at the Heritage Foundation. And finally, Brad Setzer is a senior fellow at the Morris Greenberg Center for Economic Studies. His expertise includes international macroeconomics, global capital flows, financial vulnerability analysis, sovereign debt restructuring, and the management of financial crises. He served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Economic Analysis in the Treasury from 2011 to 2015, and was previously Director for International Economics, serving jointly on the staff of the National Economic Council and National Security Council. I should also mention that Brad writes a great blog called Follow the Money, in which he frequently provides real insight into what's going on in the Chinese economy. So with that introduction, I'm going to give the floor to David Dollar.
Okay, thank you very much, Desmond. It's really a great pleasure to be here in your beautiful renovated building and to talk on this incredibly relevant topical subject of President Trump's China economic challenge. I'd like to introduce 3 points into the discussion. First, China is undergoing structural transformation away from reliance on exports and investment toward consumption, but it's very slow. Second point is the U.S. has a lot of legitimate economic concerns with China, most of which I would lump together under the heading of market access. And third, there's something to be said for the U.S. playing what I call responsible hardball with China, but it's a lot easier to say that phrase than to craft the specifics. So let me start with the first point. So China is undergoing structural transformation. For a long time, their economy was very dependent on the growth of exports, particularly in the 2000s. It was also always a high investment economy. When the global financial crisis hit, this was a big shock for China. Its exports dropped by about a third, and they responded with a massive stimulus program that was almost completely comprised of investment. So they took an already high investment rate and they brought it up to 50% of GDP, which we've frankly never seen before in a big market economy. And that sustained their growth for a while, but it's created the problems that they face now. To make a long story short, it's created very serious problems of excess capacity. So they've got too many empty apartments. They've overbuilt infrastructure, in my opinion. A lot of recent infrastructure is not going to have a good return. Heavy industry has very serious excess capacity. So they're running into the problem of, with excess capacity, there's very sharply diminishing marginal returns. I guess this first point I want to emphasize that there's structural change going on in China, but it's driven more by fundamentals rather than by their policy. So diminishing returns means investment is slowed down. Private investment last year grew at only 3%. That's natural in this environment of excess capacity. Exports are also growing in a very muted way because the world economy is soft. You could argue that that's another fundamental. But then there is good news. Consumption is growing quite rapidly in China, and a lot of that has to do with demographics, which is another very important fundamental. The working age population in China has peaked, so the labor force is going to start to decline. The labor market has remained tight. Wages are rising, household income's rising, and consumption's been rising quite rapidly. Consumption has been giving China about 4.5 percentage points of GDP growth in the last couple of years. And if they were satisfied with that, then this story could all have a happy ending. But the leadership is determined to keep the growth rate up around 6.5 or higher. And so they keep issuing credit, trying to encourage investment. At this point, it's like pushing on a string. They're trying to encourage investment in an environment where there's excess capacity all over the place. And so I'm very grateful that Desmond showed the picture about the credit bubble, so I don't have to go into detail. But there is this alarming rise in debt relative to GDP, particularly in the corporate sector, so there are risks rising. Now, there are things China could do on the policy front that would help. There are a lot of zombie state enterprises that need to be closed. That would shut down some of the excess capacity. They're going to have to write off their debts. The financial system will have a lot of problems. It probably needs more capital. The efficient way to do that would be to bring in private capital, including foreign capital. And then perhaps most importantly, consumption at this point of development is primarily services. So the service sectors are growing well in China, but these are relatively closed sectors. So all of the modern financial services you might think of, such as finance, media, telecom, transportation, health, these are all relatively closed, protected sectors in China, and that makes it hard to get more efficient growth. So that's really my first point, is that there's structural change going on, driven by fundamentals, going slowly, could be helped by policy, but we haven't seen much policy reform. Now that naturally leads to a second point about U.S. China relations. I spent a lot of time in this dialogue over the last 10 years, including watching some of it from the outside. The U.S. has a lot of legitimate frustrations. My own view is the policies that would help China itself with its own objectives would be very good for our mutual relationship. So if China opened up those service sectors, if it closed the zombie enterprises, if it reformed the financial system, all of that would be good for U.S. China relations. It would open up a lot of new opportunities for U.S. workers and firms. To me, the big economic problem in the relationship is really market access. U.S. exports of goods and services to China are about 1% of China's GDP. I don't think there's a magic number that's the right number, but I'm convinced that if China opened up, we would export a lot more goods and services to China, and that would help with some of China's own domestic objectives. Now, having observed this dialogue since Hank Paulson started the high-level dialogue in the Bush administration, my assessment is that we haven't made a lot of progress. In three of us up here were implicated in this, so the natural thing would be to say we've made a lot of progress. I have no idea what they're going to say, but my honest view as a China scholar is I don't think there's been a lot of progress with China opening up. It's frustrating, the slow pace of openness. Some people think that Xi Jinping, his first 5-year term, he's been dealing with political issues, corruption. He's going to line up a new leadership team at their party plenum Congress in the fall, and that reform will then take off after that. I'm skeptical. I think if you haven't seen much reform for 4 or 5 years, I'm skeptical we're going to get a lot of reform, but I hope I'm wrong about that. Now, having suggested that we haven't seen a lot of progress, I do want to highlight that I think there has been some progress. And ironically, one of the areas where there has been progress is in the exchange rate. This is an area where, in that export boom period, China was intervening in the exchange market to keep their currency low. You do that by accumulating reserves. So they accumulated $4 trillion of reserves, and I don't know anyone who thinks that any economy needs that amount of reserves. And that was a period in which China's current account surplus ballooned up above 10% of GDP. There's certainly other factors beside the currency. I think the market access issues in many ways are more important, but the currency is definitely one issue. They accumulated $4 trillion of reserves along the way. But Desmond did me a second big favor by showing you the graph about the capital flows, because in the last 2 years, this situation has really changed. And it relates to the story I was telling. You know, China went through this period of very, very intense investment. It's a country with high savings rate. They were mostly using their investment at home. But now I argue they have all this excess capacity, investment slowing down. The current account is the difference between saving and investment. And we don't see any big change in China's saving. So naturally, in that environment, you start to get pressure on the currency to depreciate. So over the last 2 years, you've had this net outflow of capital from China. They can't deploy it all at home. It's pushing down the exchange rate. And they've been intervening for the last couple years to keep the exchange rate high, not low. And the evidence for that is they've sold about $1 trillion of reserves. One of Desmond's questions is how long can that go on? Happily, I can go on for a while longer. They still have a lot of reserves, probably more than they actually need. And their policy is to try to keep their effective exchange rate stable in this situation. And I think it makes sense what they're trying to do. But it's ironic to be raising the issue of calling China a currency manipulator right now, because they are intervening to try to keep the currency high, not low. I think one of the risks that we face is you could have unruly devaluation. Their capital controls seem moderately effective, but there was $725 billion of net outflow last year. So to what extent was that something they were happy to allow, and to what extent does that reflect leakage in their capital account? So I don't have complete confidence they can manage this, but if something goes wrong, it would be an unruly devaluation of their currency because they can't stop the capital outflow. And if that accelerates towards something like $1 trillion per year, that's going to be a big problem for the world. So we've had some progress on some areas like currency, but I mostly see a lack of progress on market opening. So what should the United States do? So I've suggested that we think about playing responsible hardball, but I already signaled it's easier to say that than to work out the details. The responsible part means we shouldn't do things that hurt ourselves. I think the proposals for example, a 35 or a 45% tariff directed at China, this is going to backfire. In a world of complex global value chains, a lot of the pain would be inflicted on our partners. In other words, what we import from China has value added from South Korea and Japan, and actually from U.S. firms. So we'll end up hurting ourselves. And then one of the nice theorems of economics is that an import tax is equivalent to an export tax. So when you go down that road, you can anticipate your own exports declining because you've made your partners poorer, and typically the exchange rate appreciates when you introduce protection. So probably we would export less. That has nothing to do with retaliation. That's just economic fundamentals. But then I'm sure China would retaliate. I think one thing we can be sure about is if the U.S. does some big public protectionist thing, China will retaliate, and then you will magnify these bad effects, and we'll all end up poor. I also think naming China a currency manipulator doesn't make sense in the current environment. You can argue that there's still a lot of you can have a discussion with them about exchange rate. We shouldn't just accept that these market forces in their exchange rate are natural, because there are a lot of distortions on the Chinese side. But at the moment, they are struggling to keep the currency high, so labeling them a currency manipulator would not really be accurate. It will certainly annoy them, make it harder to make progress on real issues. So then you might ask, well, where is there any hardball? Mostly I'm arguing that some of the ideas are probably not going to work out. I personally am in favor of targeting these Chinese state enterprise investments in the United States. I think the new imbalance in the relationship is China is now investing more in the U.S. directly than we are in China. And that's odd, because we're still overwhelmingly the biggest investor in the world. But only 1.5% of our overseas investment is in China, reflecting those restrictions and distortions. Meanwhile, we're the biggest destination for Chinese investment, and a lot of these Chinese state enterprises are earning profits in a protected environment and coming into the U.S., buying their competitors. I don't see any obvious reason why we should just acquiesce to that. So I think we should look at restrictions on Chinese state enterprise acquisitions in the United States. But let me just conclude by saying I really don't think the U.S. has a lot of leverage in this situation. We're facing a China that's gradually changing in a good direction. 20 or 30 years from now, the imbalance will probably be gone. And one question is, how patient can the United States afford to be? I think it's worth looking at things that might give us leverage, but we should be careful not to shoot ourselves in the foot. It's important the two countries continue to have dialogue. So it's good news that the two presidents are planning to meet in Mar-a-Lago in early April. And I'd like to point out that when President Xi went to Pakistan, he offered an economic package of $50 billion. So one thing that could happen is the Chinese come and offer the United States an economic package of purchases and investment. And I hope that we see that as something that's not policy, might be a photo op, but those are all transactions that are going to take place anyway. So I hope we don't get seduced into thinking that a large purchase is equivalent to policy. We're looking for real policy change, and I think we're going to have to be patient to get it. 13 minutes, so I think I set a moderately good example. Okay.
Thank you very much. Rory, would you like to?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you very much, Desmond, for inviting me to your beautiful building, and thank you all for coming to listen to us. So David and Derek and Brad each have forgotten more about China than I will ever know. And so rather than trying to comment on or expand upon what David just presented, which I entirely agree with, I wanted to focus on where David ended, which is the U.S. policy dimension of it, and in particular to ask the basic question of what U.S. interests are in this relationship, this economic relationship, and what our policy should be directed towards. And I actually wanted to start exactly where David ended, with the point about transactional diplomacy as something that the Chinese are very comfortable doing. When I first got involved in U.S. China economic relations, there were visits taking place of senior Chinese leaders to the United States, and what they sought to do was to send buying missions to various states to buy soybeans or various other high-profile products that would, as David was suggesting, hit a very high dollar figure that then could make a nice photo op, a press release. And we poured cold water on that. We said, we will give you essentially no oxygen. We will not be putting out our own press releases. You're welcome to do that, but this is not something that we're going to encourage you to do, because what we want out of the relationship is policy change and systemic change, not some kind of one-time purchase announcement that may or may not even happen subsequently. Now, as David also pointed out, achieving policy change is very hard and very incremental and much less prone to victory announcements, and so it was a hard slog for us. But it is very important to resist this temptation to go for the easy announcement. Now, unfortunately, it has to be said that that tendency on the part of the Chinese seems to intersect with certain facets of the current administration's approach. Obviously, we've seen the president targeting specific companies on the U.S. side to urge them not to move their production, and very much taking a hands-on, case-by-case, announcement-by-announcement approach to policy rather than pushing for systemic change. And so that actually increases the danger that we might be tempted to go down that road. And obviously, just in the last few days, one thing we've seen is the announcement that the Trump brands were to be respected by Chinese copyright, and we've also seen a large announcement of a purchase of a building from the family of the president's son-in-law. And so it's easy to see these kinds of announcements as efforts by the Chinese side to exert influence. This is, again, it's a very habitual approach that we've seen the Chinese use in many cases. The most egregious that I can recall is when, in retaliation for a tariff that the Europeans put on the Chinese responded with a tariff on European wine because the European commissioner in charge of trade remedies happened to own a vineyard himself. So, it's a very personalized approach. That's a game that they can play very well, and it's a game that I think this administration might be tempted to play, and I really sincerely hope they do not. The second goal that I think we should not set out for ourselves in U.S. China relations is essentially to make China safe for the offshoring of companies from the United States to China. That is something we've obviously seen an enormous shift of manufacturing employment out of the United States over the last 2 decades, or decade and a half since China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. This is part of a broader global phenomenon which the trade scholar Richard Baldwin has described as the second unbundling, which is basically the concept that because in today's world of very easy international communication through email, through very good phone systems and so on, it is possible to use technology from the advanced world to combine it with labor from low-cost developing countries in a combination that, on the one hand, can increase efficiencies, but on the other hand, actually creates a gulf between the interests of advanced country companies, the multinationals who are offshoring, and the countries themselves, which obviously need to worry about how to employ all the workers who used to work in that industry back home. So, the analogy that Baldwin makes is that this is the equivalent of a coach from one team going off to coach the players of the other team. And it's not a perfect analogy because obviously trade isn't a competitive, zero-sum competitive sport, but it's very informative that we need to really worry about our team as a country rather than just simply assume that the interests of our multinational corporations are identical to the interests of the United States. And so when we are talking about negotiating a bilateral investment treaty, as we've been doing for many years, we need to remain very focused on how this enhances the interests of the United States and not simply trying to make China an even better, an even more competitive destination for U.S. companies to do their manufacturing, for the Chinese market, for third markets, and ultimately for the U.S. market as well. So I think that's the second goal that we should not set for ourselves. Now, a third goal where I feel a little more ambivalent towards is what the new director of the National Trade Council, Peter Navarro, has said it should be our goal in trade relations, which is balanced trade. Now, Peter Navarro is a PhD economist, but has been pilloried by the economics profession for this concept, the idea that we should be setting as a goal for the United States to minimize bilateral imbalances between countries. Now, I think crudely stated, and frankly, Peter Navarro has stated this fairly crudely, as has the president, that's clearly not the right way of thinking about this. But in a somewhat broader sense, it is true that China has pursued a mercantilist policy of maintaining very large surpluses through a substantial stock of domestic saving, and that set of policies has contributed to global imbalances and is a concern for the United States. And so again, in this broader sense, the issue of trade balance should be something that we should worry about. But I think that focusing on bilateral balances in the way that has been stated by the administration is not actually going to be helpful. So what should we be trying to get out of this bilateral relationship? So first of all, it's extremely important, and I think this again follows exactly from what David has said. We should be trying to strengthen China's external demand, its demand for imports, and what that involves is a further rebalancing of China's economy, and in particular a reduction in the saving rate in China, which is leading to this both excess investment domestically and a large current account surplus, which is actually in part reflected in these capital outflow numbers that we're seeing. The second interest that we have, which is about China's domestic policies, is we have an interest in China achieving and maintaining financial stability. We do not want China's financial system to crash, because a crisis in China would have very negative international spillovers, including to the United States. And any benefit that we get in terms of schadenfreude would be, swamped by the negative economic implications. So, and what we're already seeing with the downward pressure of the RMB at the moment, because a lot of domestic investors are sending their money abroad because of concerns about domestic financial stability, I think that already is a precursor. The third issue, which again concerns China's domestic policies, is this issue of excess capacity that David referred to. That's having a major downward impact on prices of the relevant commodities around the world, including in the United States. And one of the particularly pernicious aspects of Chinese policies is that because companies do not face bankruptcy and exit in the same way as they do in market economies, if someone has to go bankrupt in order to take capacity offline, and China is keeping its firms afloat in these relevant sectors, then it's always going to be our companies, our broadly understood European, U.S. or Japanese that are forced to take out their capacity rather than China doing it, even though a lot of the buildup in capacity was in China. And then the fourth goal of our policy, in my view, is, and again, exactly picking up on what David said, is to address the ways in which China is trying to not simply participate in global value chains through the natural flow of economic forces and through its comparative advantages, but the way it's trying to put its finger on the scale in ways that are very distortionary and hurt U.S. companies, U.S. Interests through forced localization of production. We just recently heard that Boeing is now going to build an entire plant in China, which I think we should all be somewhat worried about. And obviously, for Boeing, China represents a very important market, but if China is using its market as leverage to force companies to localize their production, that is a very detrimental policy for U.S. interests, and we should push back against that. Similarly, China's use of various regulatory measures and the prospect of access to its market as a way of forcing technology transfer, IP transfer to joint ventures, to Chinese entities as a condition for doing business in China. It's a very pervasive policy, and it's something that we should definitely be concerned about. Finally, just a very brief word following on again from what David said about what our sources of leverage are with the Chinese. So in the crudest terms, as David said, we export maybe 1% of U.S. GDP.
Of their GDP.
1% of their GDP we export to them.
Yeah, so less than 1% of ours.
Yeah, okay, so it's about 0.6% of ours we export to them. They export to us maybe 4% of their GDP. So that would seem to suggest that we have a little more leverage in that relationship, but it's a very, very crude form of leverage. The WTO constrains our ability to put random tariffs on countries. We could, as the nominee for U.S. Trade Representative has said, we could simply ignore the WTO, but that has very questionable consequences for the system as a whole. So that, it's something we can use, but I think we need to use it in a very, very careful and smart way. The second form of leverage is China's interest in investing in the United States and acquiring U.S. technology. This is an area which is much less constrained by international rules. It's something that we would be constraining ourselves if we were to sign a bilateral investment treaty. So it may be that we would be giving up too much leverage by signing a bilateral investment treaty with China in the near term. So that's a second source of leverage. The third source of leverage, and this is where I'll end, is through international rule writing. So we spent a lot of years negotiating a Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement with which China was not initially among the parties to. But we very much negotiated it with China in mind. The goal of a lot of the rules in the TPP was essentially to modernize the international trading system, to take into account the lessons we've learned from all of the loopholes in the existing system that China has been exploiting. And China watched this process initially with hostility, feeling that we were trying to encircle it. But over time, our Chinese interlocutors came to recognize that this was an effort to update the international trading rules for 21st century trade, and that ultimately China would probably have to comply with these rules in order to become a member of these various new agreements, maybe even of the TPP over time. And so that was already causing a thought process, if not actual policy change on the ground in China, which we have just, by withdrawing from the TPP, we have just entirely conceded that space. But the fact remains that China is very interested in being a party to the most advanced agreements out there. And so insofar as we are showing leadership in writing the rules, we can have an effect on Chinese economic policies.
Thank you very much, Rory. I just wonder whether I could interject an idea here, that you've indicated a lot of the things that we shouldn't be doing. You've also indicated that what we should be trying to do is get China to raise, to reduce its saving rate. But I guess something that really has to be a concern is that the United States is setting for itself trade balance objectives. We want to have balanced trade. We want to reduce current account surpluses. Yet the kind of macroeconomic policies that this administration seems to be pushing for go in exactly the opposite direction. In other words, what they're doing is they're proposing massive tax cuts, big increases in defense and infrastructure spending at a time that the United States is at full employment. If you just look at saving investment balance, if the United States is going about reducing its saving, boosting its investment, from a macroeconomic point of view, that means that they're going to be increasing their current account deficits. There's also got to be the concern that that mix of policy is going to force the Fed to be very much more aggressive than it otherwise would be, propel the dollar to very much higher levels. So then we've got a problem with China having a weak currency because we've got a strong currency. So I think that those kind of contradictions, we can't always keep focusing on what the Chinese should be doing there. We've got to be thinking about what the United States could be doing at home, because all of these micro kind of interventions, if your macro balances are out of whack, you're not really going to achieve that objective.
I am not going to talk as much about U.S. China, and that way I'll compliment Rory, who emphasized that. I'm going to talk more about China. I'm going to sound something like David, except as is appropriate, I'm going to sound a lot nastier than David is. The theme would probably be that China is an economic problem. It is not an economic peer. It's not going to become an economic peer while any of us, or almost any of us, are alive. And the U.S. administration needs to think about that when formulating its response. If you've heard me give this, and I see people I know who definitely heard me, and I'm sorry to be boring, but China is stagnating economically. And the way to see that, the whole field has moved in the bearish direction toward people like me, but they haven't gotten to the right conclusion yet. The way to see that, it takes time after I retire. The way to see that is to see the time frame involved. China didn't start having problems when Larry Summers noticed them in 2013. It didn't start having problems when the global financial crisis hit in 2008. The root of Chinese problems now starts in 2003, and David referenced this. I don't want to put words in his mouth, just noting that he did. This is when the consumption, investment, imbalance is created. China in 2002 and prior to this did not have a consumption, investment imbalance. It was a policy choice by the government of Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao, and Wu Bangguo, if you want to include him. You get these jumps in fixed asset investment from a reasonable annual pace to 24% annually, year after year after year. Totally unnecessary decision made for ugly political reasons, which we don't have time to go into, but which Xi Jinping is now fighting with his anti-corruption campaign. In 2009, Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao declined to take responsibility for their mistake, and in fact, they doubled down on it by ramping up the credit necessary to maintain investment growth, even though global and, in fact, Chinese demand was weakening. So to maintain investment growth for a little while longer at over 20%, we had 30% increases in bank loans. This is arguably the biggest stimulus in history. A lot of people at the time praised it. I'm not talking about people on this panel. A lot of people at the time praised it for saving the world economy. I said at the time it was a terrible idea. It was a terrible idea. It is a terrible idea, and the U.S. government was really stupid for encouraging it, among other things. We now have arguably the world's worst debt problem in China. A lot of people will say it's reassuring because the debt is domestically held. I don't find that reassuring at all. What that means is China can avoid a crisis, whereas foreign-held debt would induce a crisis and prevent them from continuing to waste money. Des put up that chart. China is more like the Japan case because the debt is domestically held, and the Japanese have managed to not solve their problems for an entire generation now. That's the direction China is heading in. China is big, but it is, as China says correctly, not rich. You can't waste trillions of dollars when you're not rich. And that's what's going on. The fundamental development of the Chinese economy in the last few years is to waste trillions of dollars. There are a lot of different ways to cut at debt, and I could spend a lot of time talking about this, and we could all debate them on the panel, and it'd be pretty boring. I'm going to give you a frame. And it's a frame I've been using since 2012. The broad money stock at the end of 2016 in the United States is $13.2 trillion. It's a almost, not quite the broadest, but it's almost as broad a measure of how much money is sloshing around the US economy. In China, it's 22.3 trillion. It's $9 trillion larger in China, even though GDP is smaller, and the stock of wealth is much smaller. Now, people will say, if there are China financial experts in the audience or up on the panel, they could say, look, China's financial system is different than the United States. All right? The translation of that is China's financial system is in much worse shape than the United States. Yes, it is different. It's different because it's really badly structured, and it's really inefficient. So congratulations, you've explained the difference between the two. But if you want numbers, this is a great number. In 2011, the gap in size of M2 between the US and China was $4 trillion. It has risen $1 trillion a year. The gap, not Chinese M2, the gap between the US and China has risen $1 trillion a year for the last 5 years. You may have noticed in the United States, we're not in danger of insufficient liquidity. We're not seeing deflation here and crashing asset markets. We're doing, at least just fine on loose money. And China's gap on M2 is expanding by $1 trillion a year for 5 straight years. So in that situation, all your policy decisions are overwhelmed by the amount of liquidity. You can't do anything. Right? You're playing around on the edges. And that's the Chinese capital market now consists of I wish I had come up with this phrase, the great ball of money, the great ball, the great wall. The money ball is sloshing around from asset to asset. That's what China's capital market is. It's not directed to the real economy, notwithstanding all the language to the contrary from the leaders. It's just jumping from property to stocks to bonds to random strange assets like garlic. Very strange bubbles. There's very little net contribution to sustainable growth. And Chinese policymakers recognize this. They talk about it. They don't do anything about it because it's hard. I'm not a big fan of Chinese GDP statistics, to say the least. I think Chinese GDP growth was actually faster in 2016 than it was in 2015, but I don't think it was 6.7%. It was probably about 4.7%. We're heading towards a situation where it's about 1.7. Not that the Chinese will report that. But beginning of next decade, you're going to be seeing Chinese growth in the frictional range, 1.2%, 1 to 2% a year. You have the debt. The debt accumulation hasn't stopped. China's talking about stopping it. They haven't done anything. You have a labor force which is shrinking and aging. You have resource depletion, which is being only very slowly addressed because it's hard to address. And then you're getting the Chinese do exactly what the Japanese did, which is talking more and more and more about innovation, because they won't take the policies that will address any of the rest of their problems. So innovation is going to come charging to their rescue. Innovation is partly philosophical, okay? I have a view of innovation. I can't give you numbers I can give you on debt and labor. But I'll tell you my view. You see if you find it convincing. I think innovation comes from competition and secure private property rights. That is not the situation in China. The Chinese don't like secure private property rights because if you cross the party, you lose your property rights, and they definitely don't like competition. Okay, so on that view, if you buy my view of innovation, you do not have a good innovation environment in China at all. In fact, you have quite the contrary. The people who would disagree with me, the remaining bulls, they're really focused, as David mentioned, on renewed reform after the Communist Party Congress later this year. And I just think this is extremely unlikely. If you go back to the 2013 third plenary, which was supposed to introduce reforms, again, many people not on this panel read them and said, oh, our new reform era. I don't know what they were reading, because if you read the documents, they don't show reform. Or not, I shouldn't say that. They don't show market-based pro-competition reform. They do show reform. And of course, nothing has happened. And nothing has happened because the documents don't say we're going to get pro-market reform. So it's weird to think that Xi Jinping was involved in the crafting of that document, has been in charge of China for these years, and magically, after the Congress, he'll be a different person. Maybe he is. Maybe he will be. I don't believe it. Let me make one point to close the China part of this and to indicate my bias here, which is I really care about the corporate sector. I've been studying the Chinese corporate sector for 20-some years. That's mostly what I do. The third plenary document talks about more cooperation between the public corporates and private corporates. This is exactly the opposite of what should happen. What's necessary is more competition. So they told you what they were going to do, and to some extent they've tried to do it. It's exactly the wrong thing to do. So that's the direction I think we're headed in. And one very visible version of that is we're taking already very large SOEs in sectors where there's barely any competition, and we're merging them in rail and building materials and shipping. So it's very hard to reconcile that with somebody who's secretly a reformer if only he had more power. And if the Chinese don't initiate reform in this party Congress, the next big chance is 2022, and by that time the country will be much more indebted, much older, and it really won't be growing at all. So that's my China section. I'll just talk about the China-U.S. for a couple minutes, but there's a frame there, which is, and I've had an extended discussion with Peter Navarro recently, and I just think that there's an element in the administration that treats China as much more worrisome than it actually is. That is not to apologize for China's trade practices, which I agree with Rory on, or at least the word he used, that they're predatory. On the Chinese side, I would say the Chinese would respond in a fairly clear fashion. We know what the principle is, which is if you single out China, they have to retaliate. So here's a very concrete illustration. If there are a whole bunch of countries we call currency manipulators and we initiate talks with a whole bunch of countries, the Chinese are fine with that. If we say China's a currency manipulator only, and we're targeting China, you're going to get Chinese retaliation. The second category is, will other countries copy the United States? In other words, is this going to spread from an American action to everyone else doing what the United States does? And that's, steel tariffs are an example there. If the US erects high steel tariffs and Chinese steel flows everywhere else in the world, everyone is going to copy us. That is more of a threat to the Chinese than an action we take that others don't copy. So those are the two principles that are going to guide China's response. I want to talk about, because Desmond asked this question and I want to answer it, and Brad I think is going to go into a lot more detail and probably give a much better answer. Capital controls are working now. I have this thing called the China Global Investment Tracker, which follows Chinese outward greenfield and M&A investments. And we've seen a clear response to China's crackdown in November, December, January, and now February. That's not all of China's capital outflow. In fact, sometimes it's inversely related to true capital outflow. But we're seeing capital controls work to at least that extent. As we all know, capital controls work until you scare somebody, like say arresting someone before a Communist Party Congress, and everybody gets scared and sends money out of the country. So I don't mean to be too optimistic. I think capital controls are working for now. As a long-term solution, they won't work. China has evidence of that, direct evidence. I don't think the Chinese are in any trouble with regard to their reserves. I think they could probably get by with under 2 trillion. 2 trillion might be a perception point, but I think 1.7 trillion in reserves, looking at China's needs, is fine. So, they've stemmed the tide of declining reserves with a more stable exchange rate policy. I think that problem, at least for the moment, is okay. It comes back ultimately to how bad the domestic financial system is, which if you don't trust the domestic finances, you send money out of the country. So if they don't solve the domestic financial problems, they're going to have an ongoing balance of payments problem, but I don't think it's acute right now. And one more point, and then I'm done, which is, I don't see the U.S. taking strong action against China this year. The Trump administration has too much on its plate, and it keeps bringing more stuff onto its plate. I think Secretary Ross will ask for and get steel, auto parts, a few other industrial tariffs. I don't think we'll see much in the way of Chinese retaliation because they don't want any instability before the Party Congress, and because the U.S. action isn't that significant. I think there are two things to look at going forward. One is whether we get a border adjustment tax. Again, that is not discriminatory against China. I don't think the Chinese would have a particular problem with it. It would put some pressure on their exchange rate, and there's a dispute over how quick and how intense the pressure would be, which is a little bit of a technical discussion, but we can have it if Des or the audience wants, or maybe Brad will bring it up. I think the big problem for the U.S. is if we don't pass some sort of tax reform, we're not going to get the labor market improvement that the Trump administration has said is going to deliver. And that is going to put a lot of pressure on the president to take the protectionist action he talked about. If the U.S. labor market is strong next year, the president can take small trade actions and claim success. But if it's not, if we don't see labor force participation continue that early blip we saw in January and February, we don't see wages rising, we're going to have a lot of pressure for protectionism next year. And in that context, the U.S. does have a huge stick to aim at the Chinese. It is crude, I agree with Rory. It's the fact that we run a $300 billion goods and services deficit with them, and they need the money. And if we threaten that money, we have a lot of leverage. That does not mean we will use it smartly. It does not mean that we should use it, but that's my worry. My worry is not this year. My worry is next year. If the president can't get tax reform, if the labor market doesn't improve, we're going to resort to crude measures, and we have a really big stick.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. I quickly realized when Desmond was reading my bio that he kind of left off the general consensus of the arc of my career, which it would be succinctly summarized, is that most of the U.S. government quickly concluded that Brad is a far better blogger than he is bureaucrat. It's the downside of being a prolific blogger is it is hard to come up with something new to say. So I apologize if I end up repeating what I have already written. But I thought I would try to highlight three particular points, some points which will be a little bit in disagreement with at least some members of the panel. The first point I'd like to emphasize a little bit more than has been done so far is that China's fundamental macro problem, in my view, is less excessive investment, although I'm not going to deny that investment is wildly excessive. It is really excessive savings, and that the only durable solution to the macro imbalances that have developed between China and the world is a set of policies that bring down China's savings rate. Second point I want to try to make is that we're actually, contrary to the views of some in the markets, maybe less so people here in DC, that the exchange rate now is probably close to being at a fragile equilibrium. That isn't to say there aren't capital outflows, but I think with the new measures and with the current account surplus, it is likely and even plausible that the exchange rate could stabilize at roughly its current level, and that actually is probably about as good an outcome as the US could hope for. And then the third point, I want to I'll draw out some of the options I think are available to the US if it wants to play responsible hardball. I generally agree with Rory about what our goals should be, so I'm not going to dwell on those. So first point, China saves too much. China's savings went from 35 to 40% of China's GDP in the 1990s. 35 to 40% of GDP is what a high savings Asian economy typically looks like. That is Korea, that is Taiwan, that is Japan during its high growth phase. That level of savings went up to about 50% of China's GDP before the global crisis. It has come down a little bit, but in 2015 it was still at 48% of China's GDP. We have never, in the history of the global economy, seen an economy as big as China save as much as China. Norway, widely hailed as a model of financial prudence because Norway takes almost all of the oil export proceeds and saves them, has never, to my knowledge, been able to raise its savings rate to 50% of GDP, even when oil was above 100. The only country that has come close is Singapore. Actually, Singapore doesn't just come close, Singapore has actually exceeded China. But Singapore is a tiny city-state. It is not the world's second largest economy. What does this high level of savings mean? In my view, it means there's a constant tension between running a current account surplus, which is exporting savings to the world, exporting your surplus savings to the world, and causing problems for the world, and investing too much at home. From 2004 to 2008, and I disagree a little bit with Derek here, China, contrary to what is generally viewed, actually was holding down credit. There were tight curbs on how much banks could lend. There were huge increases in the reserve requirement to lock up funds inside the banking system. And if you look at loans relative to the size of the economy, the credit to GDP ratio, it wasn't actually going up from 2005 to 2009. What happened then? Credit was held down. The exchange rate was, in my view, obviously undervalued. The excess savings was exported to the world, and that was the policy mix that gave rise to the 10% of GDP current account surplus. After the crisis, China opened up the credit spigots. I think that was helpful to the global economy, created demand. It meant that China's excess savings was absorbed at home. But the problem is that China never durably brought its savings down. So whenever China gets worried about the very obvious excesses that have been created by high levels of investment, whenever it dials back the level of investment, the internal economy tends to slow, the external surplus tends to go up. That's what I think happened in 2014 and in 2015. When China turns the dial back up on credit, it creates more domestic financial risk, but external, there's less need to export excess savings to the world. And the economy, in my view, still responds. That's why I think China's economy, I agree it probably was coming off a low base, but picked up in 2016 and is now showing some signs of renewed growth. The risk, though, is that the underlying source of the imbalance, the high level of savings, hasn't been addressed. And I think China desperately needs a set of policy reforms to bring down savings. Fortunately, they aren't that hard. China should spend a ton more on public health. Chinese spending on public health is below that of its other emerging economies. It is tiny relative to what the US spends. China should provide its citizens with a bigger basic pension and should be more redistributive. It should finance the basic pension with a progressive income tax. China collects 1% of GDP in income tax, an abysmally low number. There is enormous scope. It's not an AEI-friendly policy, but enormous scope to raise income tax, to provide a bigger, deeper, broader social safety net, to spur Chinese consumption, and make the Chinese economy less dependent on investment. Until that happens, there is always a trade-off between domestic and external risk. All right, I'll give my little lecture. Second point, the exchange rate is probably pretty close to being right for right now. Capital flows are probably close to being reasonably balanced. Let me give a little bit of a history about what happened. China's, broadly speaking, depreciated along with the dollar from 2001 to 2005. In 2005, China's currency, on a real basis against the full set of its trading partners, was extraordinarily undervalued. China started to appreciate against the dollar in 2005, moving very, very slowly, moved much faster in 2007, reasonably fast in the first part of 2008, stopped for a while during the crisis, went up another 10% after the crisis, and over the past 2 years has gone down 10% against the dollar. Broadly speaking, there's a fairly similar move against a basket of China's currencies, trading partners. But since the peak, China's currency is basically down 10% against the dollar and close to 10% against the basket. The problem that this produced is that by depreciating the currency, and in part, China needed to depreciate a currency against the dollar because the dollar went up so much in 2014 against many of China's other trading partners. But when China did that depreciation against the dollar, it created expectations that it wanted a weaker currency. And those expectations, in my view, spurred large-scale capital outflows. The corollary to that is that if China stabilizes its currency in a clear way, a large share of the capital outflows would disappear. That the outflows are determined by the depreciation. The depreciation is causing a lot of the outflows, not the other way around. That is part of the reason why almost all indicators suggest that capital outflows have slowed in the first part of this year. Why? That China's currency has basically been stable against the dollar and stable against a basket. So it's a mix of tighter controls and also stability. Corollary to all that is that this is like what we should hope for. We shouldn't be trying to destabilize China's efforts to manage its currency when China manages currency in a way that is largely consistent with US interest. We don't want a big depreciation. Letting China's currency float right now without more fundamental changes in China would mean a big depreciation. Now, can this work? Let me give you a little bit of math. China's lost, as everyone has said, $1 trillion in reserves since its peak. My view is that China actually had a little bit more than $4 trillion. that in the run-up to 2014, China was stocking some money away in the state banking system. So there's a little bit of a cushion there, a little bit of extra money in the China Investment Corporation. But basically, they've lost $1 trillion. However, 500 billion of that was to repay short-term external debt that was taken on in the preceding 2 years. No big deal. And of the remainder, about half is associated with increases in the external lending of the China Development Bank and other state banks, as well as easily regulated portfolio outflows from regulated domestic financial institutions. So if you cut those flows off, you only have another 250 in outflows that have to be financed out of reserves. Of that, you look at the crazy FDI outflows that took place last year, they kind of sum up to about 200 billion. So when you look at everything, I don't see an enduring imbalance in flows that will necessarily drive China's currency lower, so long as China doesn't introduce expectations that it wants a further depreciation, and so long as China is willing to tighten the screws on the state institutions that have driven much of the outflow. Final point, and I'll try to be brief. What are the options for responsible toughness, responsible hardball? I generally think we need to recognize that China, if you look at like a host of indicators, China is no longer way out of line in terms of its export to GDP ratio. Exports to GDP have kind of come down. They're high, but they're not inconsistent with, say, the export orientation of Europe. Where China really looks off the charts is in its low level of imports, and particularly its low level of manufactured imports. On those metrics, China is, the level of imports is very low and it's going down. And then China has set forth policy goals to bring those imports lower, targeting key US exports like aircraft, like medical equipment, like semiconductors. That's kind of the subset of goals, or subset of policies, rather than the exchange rate policy, where I think the US probably should be most focused on. What set of tools are out there? There's kind of the Obama administration trumped up set of tools. Dumping cases, anti-subsidies cases, offensive cases in the WTO to try to change Chinese policy, extended to a broader set of sectors. There's another subset which you might categorize as a little bit beyond where the Obama administration went, but kind of a little bit where Roy kind of wanted to go, and it kind of at the edge of WTO consistency. Beyond the Obama administration, a tougher approach to Chinese investment in the US. Raises no WTO issues. New safeguards cases. There's some WTO challenges, but Bob Lighthizer has more or less signaled he's willing to do safeguards, so actions against surges in imports, even if the WTO might rule against the US. And then the big one would be a Section 301 case against Chinese industrial policy, arguing that Chinese industrial policies have discriminated against US interest in ways that are not captured by China's WTO commitment. That case, I think, could be brought. The hard part is the likely action or tariffs that would come in response would probably be judged WTO illegal. So you could play with that space, and I think there's some intellectual basis for doing so, but there's some risk that the WTO will rule against you. And then set aside the various options around currency, there is the clearly WTO illegal across the board tariffs. I kind of agree with Derek. It seems likely the Trump administration is going to be within the existing playbook with a little bit more rhetoric and at the margins of the WTO, and not immediately go to clearly in violation of the WTO.
Thank you. Just before I turn it over to question and answer, I just want to give each of the panelists a chance to respond to what the others were saying. I would just wonder whether I noted somewhat of a difference in terms of attitude towards the creation of a credit bubble and what the cost of that might be. Brad seemed to be somewhat sanguine about it, thinking that expanding credit at a rapid rate won't have such big long-run costs. But there was also the point on capital outflows, and I think Derek, mentioned something like the border tax. If the border tax were imposed in the United States, if we made that kind of adjustment, that would be another factor that would really drive the dollar up. And I'm just wondering whether if we saw a very strong dollar, China would obviously have to de-link from the dollar, otherwise it's appreciating against all the other currencies in the world. And I was just wondering how that might fit into the capital outflow problem, that could be a source of having the U.S. China currency depreciate against the dollar, encourage people to move capital out while the going was good. But if you've got anything,
I had "kill Brad" written down. Is that part of this discussion? I want to just say about the China part of this. I treat China as a large economy, and for me, large economies get their own house in order first. That certainly includes the United States, and then the external actions are secondary. So to me, it all starts with Chinese domestic finance. What Brad just said here on the external side, I largely agree with. And we just haven't talked that much about various U.S. kind of policy shocks and how the Chinese would respond. Where I disagree, and it's relevant to the capital outflow problem, directly relevant, the 2009 credit stimulus may or may not have been good for the world. It was certainly good for some commodities producers until it ended, and then their situations changed rather dramatically. It was definitely not good for China. Brad and I sort of said the same thing. I talked about M2, he talked about excess savings being obviously a huge component of M2. But where we clash is not that part. And I don't mean to accuse you of this, but it's relevant to Dez's question. You kind of skimmed over capital misallocation. Like, there's too much savings. Well, the problem isn't just that there's too much savings. It's that trillions of dollars of money of the savings are being wasted. They're being lost. And the Chinese are replacing the savings because they fear against not just lack of pension insurance, but the stability of the banking system, which is also connected to capital outflow. So from the China perspective, not from the global perspective, which I realize is your emphasis, we don't disagree that much, because on the global side we largely agree. From the China perspective, the waste of their savings is the big issue. And you stop wasting it, you don't need as much, then it makes it easier to make the domestic adjustment, and that has beneficial effects for the world. If the Chinese are going to continue to blow tons of money, there's going to continue to be heavy capital outflow pressure, which U.S. policy could, I agree with you, Des, exacerbate.
I mean, my response, I think we're all alarmed at the rise in leverage in China, particularly corporate debt relative to GDP. I would say that does not necessarily lead to a financial crisis, and several of us pointed out China's more like Japan than it is like the United States. You've got a big state-owned banking system lending to state-owned enterprises and local governments. So a lot of the debt problem is in-house in some way. Now, this is not a happy situation, and I think that my own view would be just take a radical approach. As I said, close zombie enterprises, privatize banks, bring in private capital. Right? I don't expect the Chinese to do those things. They're doing a lot of ad hoc measures that I think of as throwing sand in the wheels of, they're doing things to try to prevent firms from going bankrupt. They're telling banks to keep lending to essentially bankrupt enterprises. They're throwing more good capital after bad capital. All of that is wasteful, but it does not necessarily lead to a financial crisis. So I'm not quite as negative as Derek, because first, I think it's not so deterministic how it's going to end up. You can imagine a scenario where they do have a pretty serious financial crisis, and that could end up being a good thing, out of which they do a lot of reforms. Or you could imagine them kind of limping along like Japan, and as they say, doing ad hoc things. They've got this fund that takes money from successful state enterprises and helps the others. So they're taking money from the efficient firms and subsidizing the inefficient firms. So they're doing things. If that continues, I would expect their growth rate to slow down. And then just to be kind of clear about the differentiation, they're at about 25% of U.S. per capita GDP. So they can make a lot of mistakes and still grow at something like 4. That doesn't say they won't have a bad year, But if I'm projecting out over 10 years or so, I would be very surprised if they grew less than about 4. And I think they probably grow somewhat faster. They're going to grow faster than the United States. They're going to be the biggest economy in the world. They don't have to do that well. And that's why, we need to take them very seriously. And all of these distortions that everyone agreed on, it's a real serious problem for the United States because it's already a big economy and it's going to become a bigger economy.
Yeah, but just 1 second. We totally disagree on that because I don't think China will grow fast in the United States. I'm not sure it's been growing fast in the United States for the last 3 or 4 years. And they're certainly not going to catch. David, I don't want to put words in your mouth. There's an implicit convergence argument there that if they're poorer, they can grow faster. I don't care if they're poorer or richer. Policy is what determines whether you grow quickly, not your status and the income level. Otherwise, all the poor countries would be catching up to the rich countries, but they don't because they have bad policies. And China has had a slew of terrible policies. So that is an excellent clarification of the difference because I do not see that at all.
Let me clarify the clarification. Is that when Japan started having these financial issues, it was at something like 90% of U.S. per capita GDP. So you throw a lot of sand in the wheels at that level, and you go to 0, right? And I'm saying China's at 25%. So whatever the level of policy is, they're going to grow faster. If you have the same policy in that country or as one that's at 75 or 90% of the U.S., you're going to grow faster in the one that's behind recognizing the policy. I totally agree with you about the policy. The question is, policy so bad they take it as 0? I'm skeptical. I think it's more likely to, be medium single digits and not that optimistic about the U.S.
Brad.
So let me clarify one point. I certainly believe that there's been a lot of capital misallocated inside China. So I don't dispute the basic notion that the high level of savings that was intermediated through China's complex financial system, but heavily state-controlled financial system, was invested in ways that have led to large losses, and that those large losses will have to be absorbed one way or another by Chinese taxpayers. I think that's the past. The capital that has already been misallocated has already been misallocated. It's just a question who has to absorb the loss. And I would fully believe that the cost of cleaning up the credit expansion will be probably in the order of 10% or maybe a little higher of China's GDP. Putting so much of the post-crisis stimulus on the balance sheet of the state banks while not doing more through the balance sheet of China's central government, which has hardly issued any debt at all, was an error. And that error will need to be corrected. Where I think I disagree is I don't believe that ending the capital misallocation will end the excess of savings. So if China stops investing and there aren't concurrent reforms to bring down the level of savings, I think you'll have a shortfall in internal demand that will only be solved through returning to a high level of export of savings or by relying more on external demand. So therefore, I think it is critical that any set of reforms that tries to improve the allocation of capital be paired with reforms to bring down the rate of savings.
But this is going to be quite a challenge, just given the levels that we're talking about. If you've got investment at 40, 45% of GDP, you've got to bring it down to 25% of GDP. If you don't get the savings going up, we're going to see real pressure, in terms of the exchange rate.
That's why I tried to emphasize how China could think bigger. That rather than spending 2 or 3% of GDP on public health, it should be spending 5 to 6% of GDP, which is, a big shift. That the level of basic pension that everyone is provided, independent of how much you make in contributions, could be raised quite significantly. So I agree the challenge is big, and I think that the types of reforms that are needed on the social safety net side need to be commensurately big.
Can I just add quickly? So I agree with that, Brad, and I think of the reforms I mentioned as all things that would tend to bring down the savings rate, right? So privatizing state enterprises that collect a lot of savings and then don't pay dividends to anyone, financial sector reform to remove financial repression, opening up, most of consumption is services, opening up the services so you get more competition and better products for Chinese people. So all of these are likely to reduce the savings rate.
Well, Rory has plenty of experience, given his work on Russia, on privatization to insiders that didn't fundamentally change corporate governance. But we'll set that aside.
On that note, let me throw it open to questions. Yeah, if you just wait for the mic, if I could ask you to identify yourself, and if you've got a comment, please follow it with a question.
Thank you very much. My name is Dong Huiyu with China Review News Agency of Hong Kong, and I have two questions. First one, some panelists mentioned that a big purchase from China is welcome, but not encouraged. I'm not sure if this is the thinking of Trump administration, because I'm sure if China did not buy America, President Trump would be very angry and sad. And if I think Trump administration would see the result immediately, because 2 days ago we heard a comment from the official saying that they would like to see the relations kinds of result-based or result-oriented relationship with China. So what do you think about that? How to keep the balance between the immediate result and the long-term policy change? And second question, do you believe President Trump will use the security leverage, such as Taiwan and the South China Sea, to cut the economic deals with President Xi Jinping in the upcoming summit? Thank you.
Rory, would you like
Okay,
to?
I'll take a stab at both of those. So on the first one, I think that one can have a debate, and there is an ongoing debate about a results-oriented trade policy versus a rules-oriented trade policy. Definitely, the rules orientation is what is built into the current trading system that we have. It's built into the World Trade Organization structure. And so, but you're right that Peter Navarro and others in the administration are talking about results orientation as an alternative, and the idea that you should have purchases of U.S. agricultural goods or presumably oil, whatever, to make up for imbalances. Now, you can have that debate. I mean, I would definitely fall on the side of rules, but there's, you can make arguments on the other side. But nonetheless, what I think we're talking about, what David and I were talking about, is not even a results orientation. It's much more the idea that there might be a handful of high-profile photo ops and announcements that would be a substitute for anything real and substantive, and that wouldn't even move the needle in terms of results, so that you could get like this announcement of a sale of several hundred Boeings to Chinese airlines, however million tons of soybeans, but at the end of the year, when you look at the balance of payments, you won't actually see any substantive change. And so I don't think it would even check the box in terms of a results orientation. On the question of whether there will be cross-trading between security and economics, it has been, I think, the practice over many decades to keep these two realms largely walled off from each other. The idea that we are going to trade U.S. national interests for economic interests, it just hasn't in the past really been the kind of transaction that we were willing to contemplate. Now, it is true that in the transition, Trump suggested that everything would be on the table, that this was all, that he wouldn't concede on one China until there was an overall agreement, including on trade. But what we've seen subsequently in the first call between the two presidents is that he did immediately concede on one China. So it seems like at least the one China policy is no longer going to be used as leverage by this administration. Whether there are some other kinds of cross trades that they try and do, I don't know, but I doubt it, and I'm sure that all of the advice that the president will be getting from experienced policymakers around him as opposed to some of the newcomers is that it's a bad idea.
I just, a tiny little modification of that. I agree with everything Rory just said, except I don't think it's stable. I don't think that one China is now permanently off the table. I think that everyone should be aware, just in general, perhaps that's the president's orientation. Some of his officials say, you're not going to see what we're doing coming. We're not going to tell you. We're going to surprise you. We can debate whether that's a good idea or not. I would say if the U.S. political environment turns hostile to the president next year, I don't think you should count on things he said in a phone call in February of this year.
Thanks for the clarification. Sir.
Hi, it's Chen Wei, China Daily. I have a question, 2 points. One to your comment is, how it makes sense or not, to blame China for the loss of 60,000 factories, after WTO accession. The other is how China should be blamed for the trade deficit. Actually, you have your counterparts, Stephen Roach, Robert Reich, talking about, you talked about China saved so much. They talked about U.S. didn't save enough and consume and live beyond the means. And so are those manufacturing jobs coming back? Thank you.
A lot of questions.
I'm willing to start off on that one. So, when China with its enormous labor force, with good basic education, and China with a lot of other positives, joins the WTO. Wages are very low, which I think it was natural in a low-income country. It was going to have some big effect on the United States. People should have anticipated that China was going to have comparative advantage in more labor-intensive activities, the U.S. in more capital and technology-intensive. Also, U.S. is a big agricultural exporter. So it was predictable that it was going to have a significant effect on the U.S. manufacturing, and that definitely some jobs would be lost. And it seems plausible that the net change in manufacturing jobs would have been a loss. What I think was a mistake on China's part, and I agree with some of the analysis Brad was laying out. I was living in China through part of this period. China pegged its exchange rate to the dollar for a while. Initially, it was at a level that seemed to be appropriate. There was no big imbalance, so China started exporting a lot, but it was also importing a lot. And then it was in the early 2000s that the big imbalance started developing. And as Brad said, the US dollar started depreciating against other currencies. And I think China's mistake was it followed the dollar down. It wasn't really appropriate. There was very fast productivity growth. So I think China made some policy mistakes that led to excessive saving, excessive current account surplus. And that exacerbated it was going to be a tough adjustment in the United States, but it was exacerbated. Now, I would also say the U.S. made things worse, because if you remember in the 2000s, we cut taxes and fought 2 wars. So I think that was a macroeconomic policy mistake on the U.S. side that contributed to a large deficit. So I see the 2 sides definitely should take some blame, but I do think that big imbalance in the mid-2000s, 10% of Chinese GDP and current account surplus, U.S. deficit got above 7%. Those are unsustainable, problematic imbalances, and we should both take responsibility for letting that happen.
Maybe I can fill in to bring one of Desmond's earlier points back in. If you look at global real interest rates during the past 10, 12 years, they've been very low and falling, which suggests that there's always blame on 2 sides. But in general, the global economy has been more characterized by an excess of savings. So I think that the countries that were pumping extra savings into the world economy were doing so in ways that drove down interest rates and induced others to borrow, not the other way around. There is a real possibility that could change. And I think that's the possibility that Desmond put forward. A big tax cut at a point when the U.S. economy is broadly growing at potential that pushes the U.S. into an overheated stage that pulls up U.S. real interest rates, then that would be more on the U.S.'s side. It'd be the U.S. has to have high real interest rates to pull in savings from outside of the world rather than the opposite.
Thank you. Wolfgang Muno, American Institute for Contemporary German Studies, fellow currently from Germany, obviously. Thank you for this very interesting discussion. I think Derek Scissor mentioned that trade might not be on top of the agenda currently, with all other things being on the agenda, but might come next year. I would like to ask the other fellows if they would agree to that. And second question, well, China is not the only country which has explicitly been criticized. Germany is another one. Well, who will be the first target, let's say? I think, or let's say Mexico might be the first concrete target right now. Who will be second then?
Thanks for that question. Maybe we can broaden it to the idea that Derek put forward, that China wouldn't respond badly if everybody was declared a currency manipulator. I'm not sure how that could be, but you're certainly right in mentioning Germany. That right now China has got a current account surplus, if I'm not mistaken, of something like 2-3% of GDP. Whereas Germany is more something like 8 or 9% of GDP. So if there is an imbalance in the world, Germany really, and in fact, the German current account surplus right now is, in absolute terms, larger than that of China. But perhaps if we could just have some of the panelists, just weigh in on this, and the issue of currency manipulation.
So just to follow on the timing question, I think that Derek is probably right. I'd make the argument in a slightly different way, which is that it seems like the main play of the administration at the moment on trade policy is this border adjustment tax that Desmond was mentioning, and the notion that they could have an across-the-board 20% tax on all imports and have exports deducted from the tax base, and that would have, it certainly have the symbolic protectionist message that Trump was talking about on the campaign, even if it wasn't exactly the numbers that he mentioned with respect to Mexico and China. Now, my view is that tax is dead in the water, that it will simply not pass because it's too hard, there's too much opposition, and they have a razor-thin majority in the Senate, so it's just not going to happen, certainly not this year. And as a result, when that fails, that's what would create pressures for this, the more directly protectionist ad hoc tariffs that Derek was mentioning, and that would come later on.
So the comment I want to make about that is that I think I disagree with Rory about the tax being dead, and sort of I think I agree with what he's implying, that we better hope the tax isn't dead. The reason I disagree with Rory about the BAT part of the tax reform being dead is we have I am not at all an expert on healthcare, but it appears that the healthcare proposal that is in front of us is going to be deficit enhancing, if you want to use complementary language. The tax reform, the House leadership tax reform could be deficit neutral, not unreasonable. It's definitely not going to be deficit neutral without the BAT. And so, without the reason it passes is because, notwithstanding the lobbying against it, notwithstanding these senators clucking as they currently are, they need the money. And that tends to be a very powerful thing in Congress. If it doesn't pass, which of course is absolutely a live possibility, we disagree on the probabilities, not that it's a lock to pass. It's nowhere near a lock to pass. I do agree that that's the problem then. If we have an action that's tax reform, which is stimulative, which boosts, whether it's sustainable or not, that remains to be seen, it boosts U.S. labor market outcomes, at least in the short term, and we have an act that looks like it's addressing America's trade problems, whether it is or it isn't, that takes the pressure off. If we don't get it, we're going to be much more likely to get unilateral trade action next year. In terms of what country comes first, I don't think this is determined by who has the biggest current account surplus. It's determined by language on the campaign. And so it's going to be hard to shift over to targeting Germany when Mexico and China were the clear leaders on the hit parade. I think Germany, so it gets the delay because I don't think we're going to act in 2017 in a very strong fashion. It gets a further delay because you can't really act against the Germans until you act against the Chinese and the Mexicans. And I say that, obviously this is a political statement. It's not talking about what the ideal economic policy is.
I'm going to make 2 quick points. One, if you're going to name China on the currency side, in my view, it's very hard not to also name some of China's East Asian neighbors. Taiwan, which has a bigger current account surplus than Germany.
Is Taiwan not part of one China?
We need to amend my comments so that they are politically correct from both sides of the strait, and let's insert all that into the transcript. It was a statement about current account surplus math, not about cross-strait politics. And then whatever caveats to get it right, but the country generally known as South Korea also has a rather large current account surplus, and it also has bought foreign exchange within the past 12 months. One last point where I'm going to disagree with Derek. I'm going to advertise a paper that I just wrote. A BAT, or border adjustment, only generates long-run revenue if you run a trade deficit in perpetuity. So I'm not convinced it generates long-run revenue.
It might be increasing revenue the way we're going.
It could well increase revenue over the next 3 years, but we probably eventually are going to have to pay interest on our external debt. And when we start paying interest on our external debt, and it may be in 5 years, it may be we will pay interest when we pay more interest, and when that becomes a more binding constraint, then over time, the current account deficit will increasingly become interest payments rather than the trade deficit. And so in order to maintain a stable debt to GDP ratio, the trade deficit over a long horizon has to come down somewhat. And my personal view is that needs to be reflected in your long-run estimates of the revenue that you get from a border adjustment tax.
Yeah. See, he keeps saying long run, and I was talking about Congress, so obviously we're not really disagreeing with each other at all.
We're trying, though.
So,
Hi, Pat Spann, just myself, and I'm wondering if you could comment on the industrial business commercial elites in China. Are they the same as the party elites? And if not, what type of relationship do they have? And if they are different, do you see divergence coming in the future?
Right, so let me
go
start
ahead,
on
David.
that one. So I think in general, the industrial corporate elites are the same as the political party elites. Communist Party has put people in position in big banks and state enterprises, and obviously local government. Of course, there are a lot of private firms in China. The strength of the private firms, I think, are medium-sized firms. But there are a few well-known big Chinese firms. Mostly those entrepreneurs have joined the Communist Party, and I would put them in there. They may not have high-level positions in the Communist Party, but I would put them in there as part of the elite. So I do think part of the problem they have with reform, links to their political system. That basically you've got a complicated political system where there's a lot of patronage, and part of that is people running enterprises or local governments having access to credit and being able to do projects from which they siphon off X percentage of the project. So it's not so easy to just follow through on the economic reforms that we can lay out sound very straightforward. Let zombie enterprises close, privatize banks, open up these sectors for competition. You're going to destroy a lot of rents that probably are a fundamental part of the political system.
Thank you. Rita Chen from the Central News Agency, Taiwan. It seems like from direct, it seems like I learned this is like all politics are local, not only for the U.S. but for China. I'm wondering that how will you suggest President Trump for his local politics interest. When he met with the President Xi, when he opened the gift box, what is like the must-have gift from Xi? Otherwise, that he has to walk away. And then you also mentioned about the innovation, that China is maybe doesn't like the innovation because they doesn't like the competition. However, China is really good at like copy from others. So does U.S. really have any powerful or effective leverage to sort out the problem? Thank you.
I'm going to totally ignore your first question. I wouldn't say China doesn't like innovation. I think they haven't created the right environment for innovation. I get a lot of, because I work on Chinese investment, I have a lot of Chinese entrepreneurs who say, how can you say Chinese can't innovate? I'm not saying that at all. They've been creating an environment where China can innovate. They are good at copying, they're also good at stealing. And that gets me to an answer to your question. The way I would respond, one of the ways I would respond, I wouldn't focus on the trade deficit. I wouldn't restrict Chinese state-owned investment in the U.S. because I don't really care about the pedigree of the company. The bulk of Chinese investment in the U.S. is now by what we would call private companies. They're not necessarily private companies the same way that American companies are private, but nonetheless, they're not state-owned. I would do things like, if you have received stolen IP, we're going to sanction you. Not you stole it, because that's hard to determine, but if you've received it, if technology that lay in or innovative ideas that were in hands of U.S. firms show up in your firms, and we don't have any parallel research program, and there's no tracking of where this came from, and we'd have to document this, those firms are the ones we sanction. So we don't do it on the basis of the outcome, which is the trade balance. We don't do it on the basis of label. We do it on the basis of action. David sort of suggested this before. This is easier for me to say than it is to do. It requires work and documentation, and you can't do it right away. Actually, I could give the U.S. government about a dozen Chinese firms that have clearly received stolen IP, and other people could give them more. But nonetheless, it's a research project. It's not a point at trade deficit and shoot. And so it's less appealing politically. But that's the kind of thing that the U.S. can do. Rory and Brad were both in the previous administration. The previous administration, of course, tried to broker a deal on suspending commercials. I should be careful about how I characterize it. Tried to broker a cyber deal. And the metrics that have been used to track that don't bear on what I care about. I don't care about what existing outlets have been doing. I only care about the transfer of technology. So if you wanted to make this a broader issue than just IP or just theft, you could just say, as other panelists have said, the US should be responding to coercive technology transfer. Now, in terms of a gift that I am willing to discuss that Xi Jinping would be giving to President Trump, I just don't believe it. I would just say, look, don't promise me stuff. Just do it. Just change your behavior in some way. You can decide. If I would want President Trump, if I were advising President Trump, I would give them a list of 10 things. Pick one. You decide how you're going to change your behavior. Don't make a grand announcement. Certainly the Chinese have always been into this, and I'm afraid the U.S. is falling prey to this. And I think my colleagues have talked about this to some extent. Theatrics are not going to help a year and a half from now in terms of U.S. political pressure. So this meeting, which I think is actually about North Korea, but that's just my opinion, is not. I don't care about what comes out of the meeting in terms of economics. I'll care a year from now if we see changes on the ground in Chinese behavior.
I'll put in a tiny gift, which is it wouldn't be bad if the exchange rate stayed stable from between now and then.
Sure. So there was a suggestion of some sort of restrictive mechanism on inbound Chinese investment. What might that look like? How might one implement those restrictions? And Derek, you just suggested maybe that's not such a good idea. I'd be interested in a response to whatever the mechanism is, why you think it's not a good idea.
Right. So
I'm sorry, I'm Andrew Heimert from the U.S. Federal Trade Commission. Apologies to put that at the end.
Right. So I'm the one who suggested it. So it seems to me you've got two routes. You could either broaden CFIUS, so we have this Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., which has, terms of reference to look pretty narrowly at national security issues, and I think they do a reasonably good job. They look at about 20 Chinese transactions a year, most of which go through. So we're very, very open. So you could broaden the CFIUS mandate to basically require them to take a hard look. I wouldn't single out China. I would make it all state-owned enterprises, and you could put an exception in for any countries with which we have investment treaties, such as South Korea, for example. But you could either require CFIUS to take a hard look at all state-owned enterprise mergers and acquisitions, or you could do it separate. You could keep CFIUS narrowly focused on national security, which has a certain logic, and come up with a different, legislative mechanism to prevent state-owned enterprise acquisitions. Is what I'm talking about. We don't have any prohibitions on greenfield investment. That seems reasonable to me to keep that in place. But I don't have a presumption that a foreign state-owned enterprise taking over an American company is good for the American economy in the same way that we have that presumption for private enterprises.
So my response would be, if you do that, if you formalize, you're just going to get the Chinese to game the definition of state-owned enterprise. And in fact, with a bunch of legislation that's been drafted, that's been sent at me, we spent a lot of time talking about what a proper definition of a state-owned enterprise is, which has not been settled in the academic literature, in my opinion, and it's very difficult to operationalize. I don't care about the pedigree. The Chinese can easily call an enterprise private and subsidize it sufficiently that it's engaged in anti-competitive behavior in the United States. It is not acting in the interest of the U.S. So I would be looking to enforce the rule of law. We have a couple of glaring instances where rule of law has not been applied to Chinese firms. I don't think disclosure requirements are applied on a consistent basis to Chinese firms. So I would rather go that way. I would rather check behavior on the ground rather than talking about the history of the company or other aspects associated with the company. What we're trying to do is check bad practices. And I'd rather go directly at the bad practices than a proxy for the bad practices like state ownership.
So just to put a slightly different twist from either of those two, the way I raised this issue was simply that access to the investment market in the United States is something, A, that China wants, and B, something that we have the ability under international rules that we have signed on to restrict. And so that is just pure and simple a source of leverage. So even if it's not actually a good thing for us, I don't think that the loss to the US economy from not getting SOE, for example, investment from China is going to be particularly significant because they're not bringing a ton of technology with them. They're not bringing a ton of really great managerial practices that we can learn from. So as a result, it's something that we could, without cutting off our nose to spite our face, we could restrict if China didn't give us something in return. And so we can hold that out as a threat. Whether or not we actually want to follow through on the threat is a secondary question.
No, let me just, since we all have views on this, and I agree with Rory's basic view that this is a source of leverage, and the key question becomes, what do you use that leverage for? What's the ask that goes with it? And is the ask a narrow one or is it a broad one? If it's a narrow, if U.S. companies cannot invest in China in the same sector, you can't invest in the U.S. in this sector? Or is it a broader one? Well, we don't like your industrial policy. Until you change your industrial policy, we're going to adopt a more skeptical view on investment. I lean towards the latter, and I wouldn't limit it to state enterprises because that's too easily gamed.
Let me just take a couple of questions and we'll
Group the answers. Yes.
Hi, this is Jia Ma from Howard University. So my question is about innovation. So under the current harsh immigration policy in the U.S., it seems that there is a trend that many Chinese technical talents in Silicon Valley are going back to China, and Chinese government are obviously really welcome them. So this will definitely promote the innovation of China in the future. So how do you foresee this trend will impact the U.S., or will it decrease the leverage for the U.S.? Thank you.
I would say, oh, sorry, you're going to take a couple,
just
yeah.
take another one.
Thank you. My name is Ken Scabby, the visiting fellow in CSIS. Mr. Mark Froggatt mentioned about the TPP, and I think it is very interesting that China was actually trying to catch up the TPP standard. And so I guess my question is about what's the post-TPP. So I want to ask, how do you see the possibility of the TPP 11, TPP without US, and also the bilateral negotiation, especially with Japan? Thank you.
Okay, David.
So on the immigration, and I do think this is a big advantage of the United States, is that it's been relatively open to immigration. I mentioned, China's demographics are really very difficult. It's really hard to see the Chinese labor force growing in the future. It's hard to see China opening up and welcoming a lot of immigration. In the U.S., we have the potential to have labor force growth, but immigration's a big part of that, and high-end skilled immigration, I think, is particularly important. So I think it's great that we have 400,000 Chinese students in the U.S. and other students. Nothing prejudicial about China. I welcome all these foreign students, and I would give green cards to all the foreign students that study in the United States, because I think this is the key, part of the key to our innovation is the entrepreneurial spirit we get. So I think if it's serious, it's going to hurt the U.S. economy.
Anybody want to take on the TPP?
It was mostly, do you want TPP?
Want to do immigration first?
Yeah. Have I mentioned AI does not have an immigration scholar? So unfortunately, I can't answer the question. I'm restricted by the institutional barrier. Actually, we don't have any institutional barriers here, so I could talk about anything I wanted. Let me just clarify. My problem is not the talent of the Chinese people. My problem is the system in China. One of the reasons I would expect Chinese entrepreneurs to do much better outside of China than in China, because not everywhere outside China, but for example in the US than in China. So I don't think, excuse me, returning talent solves China's problem. China's problem is based on the fact that the party doesn't like competition, and it especially doesn't like competition with publicly owned assets. Now on the US side, what you hope is that there is a recognition of differences in kinds of immigration, differences in a forward-looking policy that says, I want a different policy going forward. Economists really don't like, in general, retroactive policies that you go backwards and try to change things that have already happened. That tends to be extremely disruptive to expectations. So I think we have obviously not settled where the U.S. is going. If the U.S. is going to try to disrupt its past immigration practices, I think that's quite harmful. I think I'm hoping for a forward-looking U.S. immigration policy. It won't be perfect, but if it's forward-looking, like from here we're going to do this, I think then the harmful possibilities are pretty limited.
Anybody want to take on TPP?
I brought it up, so I should probably say something. I think that what seems to be the current best hope, and I don't know how realistic this is that the U.S. and Japan will move forward bilaterally, that somehow Trump will get a better deal because he's just much more persuasive than his predecessors, and we have so much more clout in a bilateral negotiation. That's the notion. And that after that, the other TPP countries will somehow join this bilateral agreement. Now, I think it all looks very, very difficult, and I certainly don't expect that much progress will be made, even on U.S.-Japan, quickly at all. I think, a lot of TPP was a very, very carefully balanced construction with all these different interests involved, and a lot of bilateral conversations among all of the members. It does not hold without the United States. All of these agreements are going to have to be renegotiated among the 11, and so I think that seems to me to be a bit of a fantasy, especially as it is now clear. I mean, it's one thing for the 11 to move forward in a Hillary Clinton presidency where they might have been counting on her changing her mind at a later date and joining the original agreement, but in the current world where I think there's essentially no prospect that Donald Trump is going to flip-flop on TPP and suddenly decide that it was a good deal, I just think that the 11 moving forward without the United States is a fantasy.
I'm going to amend or add to, because I agree with Rory. I'll say, trying to be too much of an insider here because I'm not, the very top of the administration wants a bilateral trade deal. They want a trade success. They want it maybe in part for some people so they can say, look, we're not protectionists, and then they can take protectionist measures. But I don't mean that as a promise. I mean it as a test. If the administration can't find a bilateral trade deal that it can negotiate and do a good job on, then the rest of this, your question, TPP, all of this doesn't work. Right? Japan is a hard bilateral trade deal. If you can't even find an easy one, you're not going to get Japan. So I think we have an opportunity to take the president as his word. It's not just stuff that he says publicly, it's stuff he says privately. The U.S. should look for and find bilateral trade deals this year, at least one. If we can't do that, then the rest of this is not realistic, and then we're in the world that Rory is suggesting.
Do you have a nominee for the? Since I agree with you that Japan seems hard. What is the win set that you have in mind?
I have a number of nominees, none of which I'm going to say out loud.
Maybe we can just wrap this up by getting each of the panelists just to answer 2 questions, just to leave us with an impression of where they stand. The first question I would ask each to answer is, where do they see the United States in terms of taking trade measures in this year? Do we need to worry about a trade war, would be my first question. The second question is, where is the Chinese economy going? Is it going to be muddling through, or are we going to have a Japanese situation of very low growth for a prolonged period of time? So, if you want to take on those 2 just very briefly.
Right, so I think we'll muddle through on both. So I agree. I think it was in the spirit of something Derek was saying. I don't see trade being on the agenda here in Washington this year, given health care, tax reform, which has a little bit of trade, in the border adjustment. So I don't think this year. I think the summit is going to primarily focus on North Korea. There'll be some discussion of trade, but I don't see the U.S. doing harsh protectionist measures this year. But I think it's an interesting thought that if you don't have border adjustment and the larger tax reform, and depending on how the U.S. economy is going, it could come onto the agenda next year. In China, this is a holding year. There's not going to be a lot of reform, but probably they can keep it all together with duct tape and prevent some kind of financial crisis or exchange rate crisis this year. And then after the end of the year, the key question is, does the new leadership really do anything serious in terms of reform? Several of us were skeptical, but let's see what happens, and maybe China will surprise us.
Thank you. Rory.
So I think I basically agree on both. I think that there will be, insofar as there are trade measures this year, there will be more in the conventional trade remedies space rather than something really exotic and outrageous. And that could happen next year. We'll have to see. The trade remedies is itself, I think, very difficult. Every administration seems to come in thinking that the last administration was too soft and that they are going to be tough, and then they look at the kinds of tools we actually have and the rules around them, and those rules are there for a good reason, and they discover that, in fact, there isn't a lot more that can actually be done. So I think that could be much more in the realm of symbolism than actual action. And then in terms of China, I mean, I very much defer to the others on the panel. I mean, my view is that China needs to slow, and that the longer they force growth to remain in the 6 to 7% range, the more buildup of problems they're creating, and the harder the subsequent cleanup is going to be for them. So if China were to slow to 5.5% in 2018 and then 4.5% in 2019, I think that would be very good for China, frankly.
So I'll take off from there, since I think China's growth is actually already below 5% GDP, if you care about that. Income growth being more important, but it's too much to talk about right now. That's one of the reasons they're refusing to grow more slowly, because they're presenting to you an artificially high growth, and people don't understand why they're sustaining it. Well, it's not the actual growth. And so if you're slipping from 4.7 to 2.7, it's a lot scarier. I don't think there's going to be a problem this year. Brad and I, and maybe the others as well, agree that the macroeconomic trajectory is positive. 2015 was worse than 2016. And no one wants to rock the boat this year. So I think this year will be fine. 2018, we're going to have to see reforms, as my fellow panelists have said. If we don't, we're going to start getting real stress in terms of people voting with their feet in 2019, lack of consumption, movement of capital out by ordinary people. So I think the stress year for China is 2019. The stress year for U.S. trade, as I've said before, is 2018. I don't, other than a few things that the Secretary of Commerce wants, I don't see the U.S. doing anything. If we don't get tax reform this year, healthcare is not economic stimulative. The Republicans are going to be a lot of pressure next year. They control the White House, both houses of Congress, and the economy isn't getting better. That is a lot of pressure for the administration to have to deal with.
So Derek is hard to argue with when he suggests that the administration is gearing up to be much tougher in a year than it is this year. This year does seem to be shaping up as tax reform and NAFTA, not China, rather surprisingly, but that seems to be the case. The qualification I would add to that is that if there were to be a major currency move in China, I would be surprised if there isn't a significant response in the U.S. So I do think that it depends a little bit on what happens in China. And then the second qualification is that what we call conventional trade remedies in a significant sector can generate a lot of attention and be portrayed as a trade war, when in reality, they're probably more like a modest, small skirmish. And they don't necessarily have to escalate to be a full-on trade war. But I would be surprised if one of those skirmishes doesn't end up attracting a fair amount of attention. In 2016, I think China can and will muddle through. I think there's a large discrepancy. Sorry,
2017.
Sorry.
Great prediction about 2016, though. Good job.
Always better to predict the past. I think that the metaphors that we use of China can continue as it has, 6-7, or ends up with a muddle through Japan, is too narrow a realm of possibilities. I don't think China can, even in a good case, as Rory and I think others have alluded to, grow at 6 or 7 over the long run. But I think even in a bad case, you'd have to have a really bad case for a country as poor as China to end up with 20 years of no growth or very modest real growth and no nominal growth like Japan. So I think there's the best case scenario is something of more modest, kind of 3 to 4% growth. But I don't think that best case scenario is assured, as I have alluded to, without reforms that go well beyond what has been contemplated, both true market liberalization and pairing market liberalization with a meaningful expansion of the safety net to address some of the internal imbalances.
Thank you very much. It just remains for me to thank the panelists and to tell everybody to come back here in 2018, because that looks like when the action's going to be. So.
I'm sorry we imply that your panel was mistimed.